Welcome to the InnovaBuzz podcast, where our job is to help you build visibility, professional credibility, and connection with your ideal client by putting the human at the center of innovative marketing, so you can build and strengthen an engaging, enduring relationship with your ideal clients. I'm Jürgen Strauss from InnovaBuzz, and I'm honoured that you're here with me. If you haven't joined our wonderful marketing transformation community yet, go to innovabiz.co and collect your free gift as well. Do subscribe to the show and also leave a review because it helps others find us. Let's get into today's masterclass on this InnovaBuzz podcast.
It's important to understand the context and understand where you are, but in order to deal with it, you have to deal with the people. They have all different emotions. We have all different emotional responses to the term crisis. It's about making decisions. It's about different perspectives, and all of those are related to people. So if you manage people, and if you can really take care of, their emotions, the dynamics when you work in crisis teams, like many companies do. It's about managing the dynamics in order to get the best out of the people to find solutions for the context afterwards. So I think, yes, ultimately we'll be dealing with an unforeseen situation. But before that, it's about really dealing with the people who are in it and affected by it.
Welcome back. I hope you've had an awesome week so far. Now, if you haven't yet listened to my recent conversations with Graham Miller, the author of The Human Factor, and with leadership coach Iggy Perillo, then do check them out, but only after you've listened to today's conversation, of course. I'm really excited today to have on the InnovaBuzz podcast as my guest, Thomas Lahnthaler of the Crisis Compass. Thomas is an experienced international crisis leader, a mediator, a mentor, a facilitator, and a speaker. His crisis management expertise spans over 2 decades and 23 countries where he led crisis teams in conflict and disaster contexts, responding to some of the most complex emergencies of our time. Today, he advises business leaders and teams on all aspects of crisis preparedness and response, and has a passion for developing experiential, simulated and game-based solutions for effective and innovative learning. In our discussion today, Thomas talked to me about how crisis management is managing people before managing situations. He explained the key habits to build a resilient culture and mindset, and he described communication strategies and when not to ask questions. Without further ado then, let's fly into the hive and get the buzz from Thomas Lahnthaler. Hi, I'm your host Jürgen Strauss from InnovaBuzz, and I'm really excited to welcome today to the InnovaBuzz podcast from Oslo in Norway. I think you're the first guest I've had from Norway. Thomas Lahnthaler, who's an experienced international crisis leader, a mediator, a mentor, a facilitator, and a speaker, as well as CEO and co-founder of the Crisis Compass. Welcome to the InnovaBuzz podcast, Thomas. It's a great privilege to have you as my guest.
It's an absolute pleasure to be on your podcast, Ian. Thank you very much for having me.
Now, you're connected with Scott Mason and with Oleg Lohid. Scott was on our episode 381 as a guest, and Oleg was our guest on episode 410. So a big hello to Scott and Oleg.
Wonderful people. Thank you very much also for introducing us. They set our connection up. So yeah, really appreciate that.
Now, it's interesting. Your background is in military crisis management, and you're kind of in the process of transitioning that or sharing that experience with the business world and with leaders in the business world. We were talking a little while ago when we first met about your life-changing event in Australia, because you have been to Australia, and there was an instance where you had the good fortune, and this is really rare, to be invited onto Elcho Island, which is an island off the north of Australia that is an Aboriginal community, but it's kind of a well, I'm not sure what the right term is, but it's an Aboriginal community that's kind of self-contained within that island. And the interesting thing for me when you told me that story is that normally non-Indigenous people are not invited to these communities. They kind of go there and mostly they're not welcome because they go and then leave again and they don't follow up on commitments is the perception of the communities. And this particular community was remote and kind of insular, not even inviting other Indigenous leaders in, but that was the case in this one, wasn't it? So I'm really interested to learn more about that story, hear it again, and also what impact it had on you and how that changed you.
Yeah, that story is really my life-changing story. So thank you very much for asking about it. I love to tell it. It's well, you call it coincidence or you call it luck, or I call it just simply a privilege that I ended up in that ritual. But a few steps back, this community that you mentioned, yes, they live secluded on this island and they really are self-sufficient. There's very few non-Aboriginal Australians that engage with this community usually. But the elders now already quite some years back have decided that in order to really increase this intercultural understanding between their philosophy, their way of life, and the ones of the white Australian population, they have to engage. So they started with Darwin University to engage in a Masters of Indigenous Knowledge, and part of that master was this ritual that I also happened to be part of. And this ritual went over 2.5 weeks, and it's called Mawul Rom. And the ritual is about, basically, it's conflict resolution and a leadership ritual. And the reason I ended up there was I think in the perfect time of my life. I just had come out of Afghanistan, where I'd worked for 2.5 years in humanitarian crisis management, and I was really in a hole. I sat on the sofa for most days. I didn't really know what to do. And then being actually a trained mediator, I started to look on the internet for interesting things that could motivate me again. And I came across this ritual, and it didn't say anywhere that it was only for Australians. So I just gave it a try and applied. I do think in retrospect, you said I live in Norway, in Oslo, Norway, but I'm actually from Austria. And I have no idea why Austria and Australia are so similar in English, right? But that kind of led to the fact that I ended up in this ritual, because they didn't read my application so carefully. Because when I came there, I realized I was the only non-Australian there, and so did they. So we were equally surprised, but we took it for what it was, because I just offered a different perspective, an outsider perspective to the challenges between Aboriginal and white Australians, which was also interesting. I learned a lot. But what really happened most in this ritual was that I got a very small glimpse and a brief introduction into the philosophy and the way of looking at the world that the Aborigines have. And I took so much from it, because it was incredibly challenging. So, for example, we were not allowed to ask questions. So if we coming and being trained to ask questions, that's of course it's also my profession partly, and that was very difficult, but it led to a lot of self-reflection, it led to a lot of growth, and it led to a lot of really getting to know myself better and being very founded in my own values and beliefs. And this is something that later on I try to take into my work. I try to take this into my crisis work. I try to take this into my work with teams and leaders, and it's been incredibly inspirational since.
That's a fascinating story, and it must have been a real privilege. I mean, it's funny that somebody read your application and saw Australia, same thing. It's something that I've had that experience quite a lot in the US. And people in the US, Australia must be pretty close. But that happens in Australia is quite funny. I'm curious, you mentioned, and I picked up on this in some of the stuff you've written about this experience, the idea of learning lessons without asking questions. And so what was some of to me, it says, okay, you've got to you've got to really focus on other observation skills. So what were some of the strategies that you did, and what were some of the strategies you observed from the Indigenous community, the people there, how they learnt with this rule of not asking questions?
The idea in the beginning, this was very difficult because we were pretty much told that this is the only rule. Don't ask questions. And we didn't take this particularly seriously, partly because we didn't take it seriously, but partly also because we couldn't, because we were trained since we were small. If you don't understand something, ask. And we literally understood nothing. And I was not the only one. There were so many questions, right? If you are introduced to a philosophy that you don't know, you want to know everything about it. Plus the experience being on this wonderful island, new social dynamics that you want to explore. So we asked a lot, and we were constantly reminded, no questions. And what they told us is observe, listen, and learn. And what was interesting that after day 3, it became really, really frustrating. So you could see that there was this desperation to get answers to what I didn't understand, and not only in me, but also in the other guests on that island. And then something happened, and that was really, this desperation turned into really an incredible gift, because overnight almost you said, like, I need these answers. So I give them myself, right? It was really, you turned the perspective to the inside. And that's when really magic happened, because you started to reflect over, well, what is actually leadership for me? Because I realized that before that, I was so quick in asking people that are wise, that have had lots of leadership experience, have seen the world. I kept asking, how is it? What is leadership? But I never reflected on what I actually think about it, what I take away, what I think is relevant for me. And that just gave me almost a forced opportunity to do so. And this is a wonderful strategy, because what happens is your communication changes. You're not trying to convince anymore the other person about or explore or are actually at the other person with your perspectives, but you start with yourself and you start sharing, and the sharing starts to build on each other. And what happens is then you, by nature, expand your reality even more. So this is a wonderful way to learn. And yes, I continue to ask questions, and I ask a lot of them, but here and there I do workshops where I actually do that. And I do these elements in my work for simply pushing the participants or my clients to really think about things differently and explore their own perspectives about it. And it has to do, as you said, a lot with observation. It has to do a lot with listening, but it has also to do a lot with becoming very aware of your own beliefs, of your own position, and trying and daring to share that. And if you do that, it's incredibly beneficial and really a learning experience.
That's interesting. I'll come back to the question I have around communication, asking questions. The thought that crossed my mind there was that, in the Western societies, and I think this is pretty common across all Western societies, that children, like, there's this magic age of around 2 or 3 where it's like, why is that? Why is that? Why is that? And it seems to be every single child around that age has this incessant thirst for knowledge, but they also ask this why question all the time. It's why? And often you find that parents kind of get fed up with this questioning, and at some point say, "Oh, stop! It's it. Why is the sky blue? Why are the clouds up there? Sort of why questions that as adults we don't even think about." And then at some point, that's trained out of us, but it's not just the questioning that's trained out of us, it's kind of a curiosity that's trained out of us. And yet we still ask questions, and I'm thinking we ask questions because we often are too lazy to do the work ourselves and do that, that inner reflection or self-awareness or the observation. So we kind of look for the easy way and, hey, help me do this kind of question. And so there's this, 2 things that I think are going on. And here there's a culture that is so focused on the observation part that, and I think there's a great lesson we can learn from that. How do you see that, kind of all that dichotomy, or more than a dichotomy, I guess, losing the curiosity, still asking the questions, and in some ways making it easy for ourselves, and losing the curiosity, and also losing in some ways the other senses of observation that give us information.
I think that you have wonderful points in what you've just said. It's and my perspective on this is that exactly the giving these answers too much actually kills our creativity and curiosity. What I've really started to do as a habit with my own children when they ask, and they are actually in this phase now, both of them. And yes, it can get a lot, but I have been trying to be very aware of to first play it back and say, like, well, what do you think about it? And just simply give them the chance to not immediately tell them an answer that I know why the sky is blue, but like, what do you think about it? Just to stimulate their creativity and to keep actually this almost like I give them the signal that there is space for you to come with your own answer. You don't have to always listen to what somebody else tells you. I can then share what I think about it, and you take it away. And the older we get, the more we categorize anyway, then knowledge and creative ideas. But this is for me one of the elements what kills our curiosity if we're giving too many answers. And it's also connected to this self-reflection that you mentioned, because I thought I was self-reflective. I was really not at all. And that's what I realized there, because my understanding of leadership consisted of what I had read and heard from different people. I really had never sat down until that point on that island and reflected over what do I actually think about it. And yes, I can listen. That's fine. But nobody told me like that's the answer. They just shared what they think about it. And this not trying to convince, or the understanding that there is no one truth, but it's really a mosaic of perspectives, which makes this so wonderful, I think, and which makes these connections so important, because that's just really privileged to explore new perspectives, not only with Aborigines, but actually globally. And that's really what I'm trying to do and try to facilitate. And that brings back this curiosity, brings back this interest to discover, to explore, to say, what do you actually think about this? Wow, that's a very different question, because if I know what I think about it, I'm not interrogating you what you think about it, but it's more like, I'm curious what you think, because I think that. And then it becomes more of an exchange rather than a clear question answer. And that I think is then questions are useful, but first you have to be clear with yourself what you think about it before asking.
Yeah, self-awareness. It's interesting. It always comes up, this idea of self-awareness, in a lot of the topics we speak about. It's if we take the time to reflect and really know our own values, and in this case, like, how do we learn, or how can we display leadership in a way without just asking questions or without kind of giving answers to people, then it makes a big difference. I know from my experience in the corporate world, I had an international career with leading teams from across 7, 8 different countries, different cultures, different languages. And so there was always this, for me, this curiosity when I visited a country. Like, for example, I would visit Japan, or I'd visit Korea, or I would visit China quite a lot, or India. We were talking about India earlier before we started recording. And just to learn about those cultures, which clearly are very different to our Western Anglo-Saxon culture. And I was always asking lots of questions, but the response I got was, because I displayed that curiosity, and a genuine curiosity, and a genuine willingness to learn. So I would try out, language. I'd say, how do you say that in your language, and would try it out and would make an effort to then use that later on. That actually built relationships, that people really responded to that because they could see that I was genuinely interested in their culture, in them as people, as opposed to just coming in and saying, well, I'm going to give you all the answers.
And that is a wonderful example where I think questions are very relevant. And I do think in this particular context, questions were more just, there's an underestimated element to questions, I think, and I've experienced, and that's power. So already in a situation, because if you ask a question, you automatically put the spotlight on the person you're asking it to. And particularly in the context there where I was on that island, power was a very important topic. So by simply depriving of one element that actually can give you power, it's, we were all curious, but there was no interest by this Aboriginal community to sit there and be interrogated for 2 weeks about their own culture. That was not the interest, right? So simply setting that frame also, I think it was a combination of their philosophy, that there is no one truth. It's all about connectedness and sharing. And the element like, we do not want to make this a one-way street. So we're going to make this a bit more difficult, and we play a little bit on our rules because you are on our turf. And that just really showed also the different approaches. And I think that created a lot of awareness, amongst the white population, but also in return amongst the Aboriginal population, in the sense of how difficult it is, and how difficult it is to also step out of our shoes in terms of questioning, in terms of having to categorize, having to understand everything and an explanation for everything, which is not necessarily the case on their end. But questions in cultures, and really the curiosity is important, because it connects. It's just showing interest, as you say, and it's a different form and a different intention behind that than it is than we sometimes often have with questions on a daily basis.
So with lessons that you learned there, what are some of particularly the communication strategies that you took away there that you're now implementing in your work that are lessons from that time? Because clearly stepping back and not asking questions for some time forces you to bring some other observation skills in, other learning skills in, that I'm sure if you then combine that with questions and find the right balance between them, that gives you a much bigger arsenal to choose from and use the appropriate communication means at any given time.
Communication and communication psychology is a secret obsession of mine. So there we could probably talk the whole day. I'm trying to constantly learn. I think this is also what drives me to really to learn about myself, but also to learn from others, and particularly through these connections. So communication is something that I think it's a constant learning process, because technically everybody you meet communicates differently. We have channels, we have ways how we can communicate, but I think everybody has their own style. Everybody has their own way of saying things, plus the communication that we also do non-verbally. I work a lot with things with the element of framing. So saying, in how do you approach a certain topic? Because that's completely underestimated, how, in which context you put it, and in which context you actually communicate something, how that influences both your behavior, your mindset, your reactions to it, your emotions connected to it, and that can actually have a significant outcome on how you perform, for example, in a business, or how you get through a crisis, not least, since that's what I'm working with most now. Another approach is really this, I really, really avoid qualifications. Good, bad, right, wrong. I avoid that, because that's so subjective. It's just really, the beautiful example is leadership. Technically, when we talk about leadership, we kind of implicitly always talk about good leadership. But good leadership means something very different for different people, because there is leaders that I would never consider a leader even, but for other people, they are the perfect leaders. So this topic is fascinating for me because it's so debated, but it's so subjective at the same time. And qualifying good and bad makes it almost like you split and you divide, because what's good for me is maybe bad for you. But if you approach it in a different way, if you just simply talk about leadership without qualifying it, then there is an exchange. So this is certainly a method that I apply. And then I talk a lot from my own perspective. So I really try to not generalize. I try to not make statements that are valid for everybody, but really, like, this is how I perceive it. And there's space for different opinions and different perspectives, and all have their right and their space. But I'm trying to speak of it as mine. So also to be clear that this is the way I see it, and I'm curious to hear how this. So those are a few tools that I try to very subtly apply, because my experience with communication tools is like active listening, for example, is a very, very common, very widespread tool that's often trained. It's not as easy as it looks, and it's also, if you don't tailor it to your communication style, it becomes very artificial for you as a communicator, but also the person picks up on it immediately. This is so. For example, when I learned about it the first time, and I applied it to my then girlfriend, now wife, she was like, "You're communicating very weird. I can't talk to you." Like that. And yeah, clear, because she knows me in a very different setting, right? So yeah.
Yeah, and it's the active listening thing is. I remember when we first did exercises on it in the corporate world, we were being trained in that, and it was kind of like there were 2 or 3 phrases, and one of them that I remember was, "Oh, so what I heard you say is," and then you kind of
that's a
give the
one.
person back that the phrase, and it was like, it became like when somebody else then would use that in that work context, one of the other people that you worked with would say, "So what I heard you say," and we'd both just break out laughing. You wouldn't take it seriously.
That's very common. I've heard that a lot, and I've experienced this myself, because if you're all in the same training, you know all the same things. So the moment you use that phrase, everybody's like, "Okay, are you trying to play now active listening with me?" It becomes not natural anymore. It's a nice, mood lifter, but if you really want to apply the tool, you have to make it your own. And as with every tool, I think you should make it your own. I think you should, in order to keep your authenticity with it and to really be convincing when using it, you have to see how this feels natural to you. I worked a lot as a facilitator, and I don't think I've ever used a tool or an exercise the same way twice, because I learned from using it the first time, right? And it just simply has to be authentic when I do it, because if I go according to the script, then it becomes difficult, because people will see that he's not really buying into it himself, and then already might lose my audience and connection to the group. So that's very important.
Yeah. And I find when you are natural, and I mean, there's a lot of skills obviously that are learned skills, but when they become unconscious and part of your being and consistent with your values and your whole personality, then it doesn't come across as this is learned active listening or whatever other tool that might be. And, I often am in situations where my business coach says, "Oh, you did this or you did that," when giving me feedback, and and uses some term that's like, "Okay, you're really good at active listening," for example. And I say, "Oh, was I? I just was doing my thing."
But that's the best way. If you're not even conscious about it, then you're really good at it, because then it's so natural to your communication. And I think I would like to add one thing that's often underestimated, since I just mentioned authenticity. The same is true for communication, in the way that we must never forget that technically every message we're giving is the meaning of every message we're giving is determined by the receiver, not the sender. We can have all the intention we want, but if the receiver doesn't get it, and that's very important for crisis communication, for example, but technically for all communication, it's important to have that in mind. So that often creates misunderstandings. But first of all, our intention isn't visible. Second, if the way we communicate it is important, but also to really understand that the receiver gives it meaning. So their reaction is often very different from what we intended. And that's natural, because we forget that they hear, see, read. Often these days, digital communication is a very, very good example, where the substitute of emojis for our mimic and everything cannot really make up for the context that the reader puts it in. So that's and the similar thing I've observed with authenticity, because I can always say, like, I'm authentic, but if I'm not perceived authentic, it's a different thing.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I'd add to that it's not only is it, so if I'm communicating something to you, and there's an intention behind that communication, but your interpretation is different than what my intention was, then that's to be expected in many cases. But then I have to take responsibility for that communication. First of all, I have to be aware that, hey, you're not getting it the way I intend it. And I have to take responsibility for my communication and say, well, it's not being received, so I need to change something.
Definitely. Responsibility lies on both sides with communication. I really, really support that. And there, for example, a question is very relevant. if you see the reaction isn't what you expected, it's like, okay, so what was it that how did you now hear my question or my statement, or so then the question can be very relevant.
Yeah. It's great. One of the other things you said, and this idea of that was good, or that was bad, or I'm working really hard to get those terms out of my language in that kind of context. And also I'm in situations a lot now where I'm finding that I'm giving feedback or I'm asking for feedback from people, and whenever I hear good or bad, I say, well, what was good about it? What was bad about it? So I sort of get specific, because I think that really isn't that helpful. And the other thing, when I'm giving feedback, I also, because you mentioned before that it's what resonated with you when you give that feedback. So I kind of say, rather than, oh, that was good or that was bad, I would say something like, I really liked this bit and here's why I liked it. And I thought this bit didn't work for me and here's why I thought it didn't work for me. So it's kind of like, it's me, and the person can kind of take it on board and say, well, I wanted it to work for you, so I'll make some changes, or they can say, well, that doesn't matter to me.
And that's exactly how I also do it, and how I promote people to do it. Because a wonderful example, I have to think about the website of my first company when we made that, and literally everybody told us something different. Like, oh, I like it. Oh, yeah, no, I don't like that one. That doesn't work. But it was these generalizing statements. And it's like, well, yesterday somebody told us that this works really well. So it becomes also very difficult if you're generalizing. But if you state your own opinion, you actually nobody can really attack you for your own experience or your own opinion. So you're not really giving any opportunity, because I'm saying that, yes, for me, this didn't work. That doesn't mean it doesn't work for others, but for me it didn't. And what you do with that information, that is again up to you, right? Because if you then go back and say, well, I want to change it, then potentially hasn't worked for you as well, but you didn't know before. So, because otherwise, if you're anyway convinced and one person tells you it doesn't work for me, but the others say it's fine, then you probably don't go back and change it.
That's right, because you do get lots of different feedback, and particularly when it gets specific, and something as subjective as how does that website look?
Exactly.
Okay, well, one of the things that you mentioned in some of the material that I was reading was crisis management is managing people before situations, and we've been talking about sort of, understanding people and communicating with people. So what does that mean exactly? What do you mean by that exactly?
That is a realization that I had of it, because for many years when I worked with managing crisis, I was really following and had the conviction that this is about managing situations and dealing with situations and with events. And then really the past year, when I spoke to a lot of people and asked them how their experience was, because all of a sudden crisis management turned very personal for many. It got into our living room. It wasn't, while it was at the same time on a global scale, so it was almost omnipresent. And so I asked them, so how is your experience with it? Since I've worked with it a lot, and I wanted to hear how they were doing, and what their responses really made it clearer and clearer. There's one common denominator that they all refer to, and that has something to do with emotions, people, dealing with dynamics, and it's all connected to people. And when I started to reflect a bit how I worked with it, it was less about the context. And every single time I went into the context and focused on the context, it became difficult, because it's outside my scope of influence and there's not much I can do about it. It's important to understand the context and understand where you are, but in order to deal with it, you have to deal with the people. They have all different emotions. We have all different emotional responses to the term crisis. It's about making decisions. It's about different perspectives, and all of those are related to people. So if you manage people, and if you can really take care of, well, their emotions, the dynamics when you work in crisis teams, like many companies do. It's about managing the dynamics in order to get the best out of the people to find solutions for the context afterwards. So I actually think, yes, ultimately we'll be dealing with an unforeseen situation, but before that, it's about really dealing with the people who are in it and affected by it. Because in a crisis situation, if nobody is affected by it, it's arguably not a crisis. So you have to really start there. And that usually is very powerful and helped me a lot in my mental reframing, because you take a lot of ownership back, and you actually all of a sudden have the feeling I have the ability to do something, because I can cooperate with people. I can, connect to people and work together and deal with the dynamics. I cannot do so much about the travel restrictions, let's say, to keep with the pandemic, but I can do something about how my team thinks about it, how they think about it, share perspectives, and define our problem together.
Yeah, it's a really good way to look at it. And we were talking again before we started recording. Today, as we record this, tomorrow, my wife and I were about to head off on a week's vacation for our 40th wedding anniversary. And today, the government here locally announced a 7-day hard lockdown. We can't go more than 5 kilometres from our home, and basically all restaurants and venues are shut for that period of time because of a outbreak that's rapidly spreading and of one of the Indian variants of the COVID strain. So that's a situation that's really bad, and they wanted to nip it in the bud before it gets too bad. And of course, we were looking forward to this vacation for some time, and now we're a bit sad. But immediately I kind of took the view, as soon as it was announced, I said, okay, vacation's off. Nothing I can do to change that. So how do we move forward? What do we do? So one of the questions we started discussing, how can we make next week a nice week for us, and how can we have some fun just around the home? And the other thing, of course, is looking forward to, okay, how do we rearrange the vacation and all the bookings we'd made so that we can utilize them in the future. So I think there's a lot to be said for this. Don't worry about we could have sat back and said, woe is us, because this is knocked over our holiday. And of course there was some of that there, but we kind of did that for 10 minutes and then said, okay, it's done, let's move on and influence the things that we have control over and move forward from there.
And this unfortunate situation is a perfect example how you handled it, how I try to work with clients when they're in crisis situation. It's really redirecting the focus, because the emotional response, it becomes a spiral. If you're focusing too much on the context that you can't influence, it becomes a spiral, because you get frustrated. There's a new decision. Again, you get frustrated because what frustrates us is not necessarily the decision, it's the helplessness. It's not being able to do anything with it. That frustrates us and makes us angry, and we actually put the responsibility on so many other people and factors, instead of really shifting the focus and say, like, as you would beautifully describe, well, what can we do about it? What options do we have? And very often it must not stop with simply looking at the options that you naturally are presented, but as you also said, like, create your own options. And maybe there's something we can do we haven't had on the screen yet, or maybe there was another plan that we've had a couple of years ago, which we never materialized, which doesn't require us to go anywhere else. And this shift of focus is a key criteria for effectively dealing with critical situations.
So one of the questions that I had as we were talking through that is, how do you build that kind of mindset into a business culture or a company culture, so that particularly in good times when everything's going well and there's no crisis on the horizon, and then all of a sudden something like this pandemic comes out of the blue and they have to respond to a vastly changed situation. How do you instill that resilience, that culture of we'll control what we can control and not worry about the stuff that's out of our control?
That is a great question, really, because it's a bit of my worry right now, seeing the companies getting excited that the doors in some countries open up again, and that's pretty much when you forget what has happened the past 14 months, right? Some say like, yeah, we want to do learning exercises, and I've seen that a lot, and then they do a learning exercise, but they're already back to business, and forget until the next situation hits, because it will hit. Might not be a pandemic, we don't know, but something will come again eventually. And for me, it's preparedness for crisis has its limitations. I'm very clear on that. I think planning has a lot of limitations. I think planning is also an activity that is largely based on assumptions and mental models that we've had. And if we don't identify those, we can fall into traps. I've experienced this several times. I've been really on both ends of this, where you had wonderful crisis plans, and then the crisis came and it was nothing like you had expected, and the plan just was left on the shelf. Nobody looked at it, and it wasn't relevant. And unfortunately, that happens a lot. And that's why I'm promoting really resilience and preparedness through culture. And to your question, it's culture for me is like a muscle. You have to train it. You have to keep it going. It's not something that you can ever say like, well, we're done. Our culture is ready. It has to develop. It has to naturally be trained. And that's why also preparedness is for me a process that never stops, because you also never know when the crisis comes. So you have to kind of always develop this readiness. But what is important for me is not to make this a separate activity from your everyday work. I think crisis preparedness is something that should be part of your everyday work. So the way I promote this is to really have a couple of habits, very simple habits that make your culture that make you culturally very quickly able to react, adapt, understand the situation, deal with the situation, deal with the people in it, and that is simple habits like, learn how to learn. That's one of my favorite ones. It's just really not learning only after, but it's learning as you go, and the learning doesn't stop by having the information. That's a huge gap that I often see. The information is there, what needs to be learned, but it isn't implemented. There's nothing done with it. Another thing is exchanging perspectives. It's as simple as that. Make a habit of it, because when a crisis comes, this is one of the first things to do. How do we perceive it? What's the situation? Have we all a common understanding? Emotions. Your wonderful example. I'm sure you were frustrated and angry for a while in the beginning, and disappointed, not least. All of this has space and must have space. And it's the same in a company. I often read this. I'm very critical of when I read like, well, crisis management has to be approached rationally. Yes, to a certain extent, I really agree. But you cannot not talk about emotions in crisis. They naturally trigger emotions in us, and they will come back. I've seen this so many times. If you ignore them, they come back and haunt you. They will come back at the most inconvenient moment, and then you have to deal with them. Way more intense than they were at the beginning if you had dealt with them initially. So those are simple habits, and I've worked on 8 habits that we work with our clients with that are very simple. Identify your assumptions, for example, is another one, and not least learn from other sectors. I'm a huge fan of looking beyond the scope of your own sector and look into other ones and see, well, what's there? What can we take away for our work from that? So those are things, but they have to be developed as habits. And for that, you create a culture that when the crisis hits, that you actually have made this change part of your DNA. It's mystified. It's not so scary anymore, because that's what crisis ultimately is. It's an extreme change or changes.
Yeah. It's great. The idea of sort of the daily habits, and then it becomes part of your being. You sort of learn it and practice it, and it's second nature, like we were talking earlier. You do it without even knowing about it.
And that's also the beauty with this, is that you don't have to disrupt your everyday work. You maybe just, the team continues to work in the way that it has worked before, dealing with a different project. So if you make crisis management also almost like a project, like that you treat similar to the other projects, with a different aim, with a different content and everything, but the working processes don't differ, then you're not naturally disrupting your business so much. Because that's what I often see. Everything stops. We have to set a crisis team, and when the crisis team gives us the direction, then we can continue. And that's the most dangerous thing for businesses, if they stop the business continuity.
Yeah, and I think we're seeing that a lot in government responses to the pandemic. There was a lot of, let's just wait and see what happens kind of thing, and assumptions that, it'll go away, or if we get to herd immunity or something like that, and not realizing that the speed at which this spreads and the intensity and the impact that it would have was going to be so devastating.
There's global studies that clearly say that, sorry to cut you off, just one more sentence. There's global studies that clearly say that companies who are more proactive, who really take their choices into their own hands instead of waiting and being reactive and see what happens and react to the next development in a crisis, they come out better of crisis. There was surveys, I think PwC did the survey where they really, with thousands of companies, where they said, what is your success criteria, and that came out. So if you're more proactive, if you take the choices into your own hands, you come out better of this crisis at a higher likelihood than the other way around.
And the other thing, I think, you mentioned the habits to practice those things and then being proactive. The other thing that builds, I think, is confidence. And it's certainly, a lot of the times, I think, particularly in the case of governments waiting to make decisions about whether to lock down or not in the pandemic, or whether to order certain vaccines and stockpile certain vaccines for the population or not. There's all this hesitancy around, and I think, they don't have confidence in making that decision. And I think all those habits build the confidence and build the organizational confidence as well to, okay, here's the situation, here's the decision we're going to make, and let's just do that, having considered all factors. And it kind of comes back, I was having a conversation recently with someone because we were reflecting on the current success of our sporting team that hasn't had success for quite some time, and we're saying, they'd built up this winning run, and I made the comment, well, confidence is going to go a long way here, because win after win after win after win, you build up this confidence. And so that actually contributes to the success going forward, because there's that confidence in everything they do. How do you see that playing out in kind of the business world or in teams?
Confidence is for me the key factor for decision making in crisis. And confidence can be built up. It can be trained, as you say. And part of it is through these habits, certainly. But part of it is also shifting the focus. And that brings us a little bit back to what we've discussed earlier with the right or wrong, for example. I'm very critical of qualifying decisions as right or wrong based on the result, because I think that's the focus that is on the wrong place. And that's also what I often see. If we focus too much on what could come out of a decision, that really that jeopardizes the confidence, because we don't know. Complex situations like there's now the pandemic, you don't know how a decision will play out. There's other players who make decisions. There's other dynamics that are happening at the same time. And if you want to find the perfect decision based on that, you will not find it. But with a scope of influence, if you're confident in how you made the decision, how you got to it, how the process was, that you had, like for yourself again, that you had the process in place, this will give you confidence. And the idea of this is that even 5 years later, you say back, yeah, the result was really not what I wanted, but the way we took the decision, I'm super happy about. And that's why I still think it was, in that sense, it was a good decision. But also what it does, it gives you the confidence to actually deal with an unexpected or negative result of your decision. So you're not really becoming more insecure of it, but you're simply saying, okay, decision didn't work, let's start again all over and move on. And that confidence then leads to another success and another success, because you are focusing on something that you can do something about and not something that you have no idea. So also judging decisions based on what you couldn't know before, I think for me is a mismatch.
And the other thing, that confidence gives you the ability to pivot quickly as well, because you think, okay, that's not working out. Let's decide to change direction. That does require, though, that we leave our ego aside a little bit here, right? Because if we kind of say, okay, here's the decision we made yesterday, that doesn't seem to be working out. The risk of, and we've seen examples of that in the pandemic as well, is people sort of saying, well, it's my decision, we're going to stick by that because otherwise I look bad.
And that brings us to culture back, because for me, if you practice a culture of learning rather than a culture of focusing on mistakes, which is technically the similar thing. A mistake is only really a mistake when you look back at it. Yeah. You don't know beforehand whether it's going to be a mistake. And simply saying like, okay, didn't work out. Where are learnings for us? And the learnings for me are very, very, very important to also include the positive things. So really, because we all got through the pandemic. And what I have already seen in learning exercises is like, so what do we need to improve? Yeah, fair question. But also like, what was it that actually got us through it? What were the things that we did well that actually helped us get through it? So if you include that, you also create the success versus this we can work on. Although I'm also careful with saying like, this is what we need to work on, because the next crisis might not be completely different. And then those things might not be relevant. So it's really cultural things, and in promoting this, not talking too much about mistakes, but talking about the learnings. And then automatically, I think you will leave the ego aside and you will not take it personally. You will not take it personally as like, oh, this was a failure, or I wasn't a good crisis manager. If you can say, no, I'm super happy with how we took this decision. Just didn't work out the way. And also, the ego is a funny thing, because I see that the paradox often that crisis managers, or some refer to them as crisis leaders, is they take over a lot of responsibility while at the same time saying like it's too much responsibility. So they're really neglecting their biggest assets, which is their team and the perspectives of their teams, because they feel a misplaced sense of responsibility. Yeah, they might have to take their own decision at the end, but the team is still there to support them. And usually the tip that I give them in order to also create that confidence a little bit is that I think the decision makers should separate themselves from the decision creation process, so from the choice creation process, because you can take a way more, let's say, objective and way more distance decision if you present it with the choices than if you already developing them, because we're naturally biased towards our own choices, and if we know a lot about them, the decision becomes already a bit skewed. So that's it's a fine tip, and that's very difficult for a lot of leaders because they feel a lot of loss of control. But if you actually say, I trust my team, come up with choices and present them to me. And then I listen to my intuition, my gut feeling, my experience, which of the choices works and which doesn't. And that usually is actually quite empowering, because they feel they're almost liberated of pressure, but at the same time, they say like, okay, you created great choices here. I take the decision because this feels right. And that works for me.
Yeah, that's a really great point. And because I kind of thought about some of the things that I've done where I do some research on the different options and then pull them together, and you kind of almost, as I'm going through sequentially, so I go option A, option B, option C. Oh, option C looks really interesting. And then option D, option E, option F. And kind of option C becomes the favorite until something else is really better. It's kind of the favorite, and it's only the favorite because your first impression of it in isolation was good. But if you then, if you were to step back and say, I don't know anything about any of these options A to F, and have them all presented together, it might look totally different.
That's exactly how it is, and that's also a natural process. So until this option C, your mind was open because there wasn't really a favorable option. But after that, it's not anymore, because you might have already primed yourself on that particular option. Yep. But if you are presented free, and that could be still the same effect, but if you're presented by somebody else and they explain their reasoning, they explain how they got to this choice, why they picked these options, and what the idea is behind them, you get a completely different perspective on it. You're not necessarily making your own, that you add on to that, but you also hear already other intentions, and that usually creates a bigger picture, and that makes it even richer to come to a decision, from my experience.
Fantastic. All right. Well, I just looked at the clock there.
Lots to talk about.
Talk for ages, but this is so much fun. But I think it's a good point now to move on to the buzz, which is our innovation round. And
let's do that.
It's 5 scripted questions that are designed to help our audience, who are primarily innovators and leaders in their field, with tips from your experience. So hopefully you'll give us some insightful answers, inspire them to go and do something awesome as a result today.
I can try.
All right. Not that you've not already done that, I think. So what's the number one thing anyone needs to do to be more innovative?
For me, it's about taking pressure off the term innovation. I've noticed that there's a lot of pressure related to it, finding the idea in 10 million, while we're all actually are innovators already. And looking in the mirror and say, like, I'm an innovator and I have great ideas that can help.
Yeah, I think that's really great advice. And I often talk to people. I say, well, if you improve something by 1%, I believe that's innovation. So let's celebrate that rather than kind of ignore it and look for hey, I want to come up with something that's 100% better than what we're doing now. And coming back to your habits before, if you do that 1% 100 times, you've achieved it.
And what you say is the key, because for me, innovation is anyway, it's not about finding that one idea. Yeah, there's certainly many one ideas out there, but I think it's all about knowing what to do. I compare it sometimes with, I got this beautiful skill from my mother, actually, like really, when the fridge is full with weird things because we couldn't go shopping, you still have to get together a dinner. And it's basically just making up something as you go. And it's the same for me with the resources that you have. Just use them in a different way. And again, learning from other fields. I'm a huge fan of the survival shows, because they show you what you can actually do with things that you haven't even thought of. And that's for innovation.
Yeah. Great. All right. What's the best thing you've done to develop new ideas?
I don't know the best thing. I think there's different approaches. Of course, I became self-employed in order to be able to follow my ideas. But I think when I thought about it, for me, what really works with my ideas is actually to find people who I can spar with on them, to actually share them. I think that's probably the best thing that I've done, even if they were just ideas and thoughts, because the perspectives and the dialogue that I got around them, that just usually helped me follow with the ideas and gave me new push and motivation to move forward.
Yeah, I find talking with other people often they give you some information that, you talked about learning from other fields. So they often give you information about other perspective, and it might be another field, but it's certainly the other person's perspective. You go, I hadn't thought about that. So, and then all of a sudden the idea becomes stronger, or you realize that, hey, maybe that's not going to work, but I'll change it a little bit.
Yeah, definitely. I see that the same way.
Yeah. All right. Now, do you have a favorite resource you use most often?
Favorite resource, that was a tricky one. I don't really have a practical resource, but when I thought of what really helps me to move forward and to be more productive and to be more innovative, then it's actually might be an unusual one, but it's sleep. I have I've really gotten into sleep research, and by a fantastic book by Matthew Walker, which is called Why We Sleep. It's quite recent, and it's really the newest research on sleep, and it gives you a couple of practical tools that really help me to be innovative. Like, for example, when I have a specific problem, I think about it just before I go to bed, or the rare occasions that I still have a nap with 2 small children. But but usually the brain works it out, and you come up with new ideas. And it's incredible. I mean, this is just one fraction of what sleep does. I think it's completely underestimated, and that's my strongest resource. And I've way too little at the moment. So.
That's fascinating. I'll have to look that book up. I'm not familiar with that.
It will change your life. I guarantee you that. It's a life changer, that book.
Yeah. I have heard a few people say that, if they think about what's on their mind for the day, or what the big thing that they've got to deal with tomorrow, if they think about that before they go to bed and, play some scenarios through or so on, often they wake up with the solution already sorted, because unconsciously they're working on it in their sleep. And I know I've had some things that came up either in dreams or the unconscious. So I'd often get up in the morning and I think, what was that all about? There was something going on overnight. I was sort of, I'm half conscious of there was something there, And sometimes if I can grab a hold of whatever was there, that often gives me ideas or things to take away. Yeah.
In this book, he actually, I think it was Edison, some of the great inventors had built a chair where he would nap on, and the chair was built in a way that just before he fell into deep sleep, he fell off that chair, so that he woke up, and because that's when the brain apparently is most creative. So he actually deliberately used that technique to come up with ideas and solve problems. So that's that definitely works. For me, it does.
Fascinating. Yeah, I'm not sure about falling off the chair part, but yeah. I guess maybe there's other ways to trigger you.
Yeah, I do think
up.
so.
Yeah. All right. Now, what's the best way to keep a client on track?
It's for me one of the habits that I have written about. It's the what I call the magic moment. It's regularly stopping and zooming out and seeing if we still have the same understanding, if we're still on track with the task, if still the task is actually the same. So it's really practicing this regularly. What's the situation? What's our task? What's our approach? Are we still on track? If you do that habitual, that certainly keeps you on track, and it also avoids that you really dissecting into other issues.
Yeah, I love it, and I like the idea of, because I think often we don't do that. We sort of say, "Hey, we're off track. Why is this not working? Why is that not working?" And all of a sudden, if you pay attention, you suddenly realise, oh, the goals have changed. Or a lot of people talk about, hey, the goalposts are shifting all the time. So if we take the approach that you're doing, then we realise the goalposts are changing, and then we're not, if we realise the goalposts are changing as they're changing, then we're not doing all this work that doesn't meet the new goals or the shifting situation.
Absolutely, I agree.
And final question, what's the number one thing anyone can do to differentiate themselves?
I thought a lot about that one. But I think my answer is maybe fairly simple. I think we must not forget, and this is a bit from my own experience starting two businesses. We must not forget that we are the default already unique, and that's a power. Because even if we want to work with the same things, we have different approaches to them. And I think trusting in that and remembering that you are actually unique and you are different by default, and there's a danger that you become too similar if you follow the mainstream. That can actually work really well if you do that.
Yeah. I'm just trying to think which guest this was, but it was a little while ago, said to me, we're all born different, don't die the same.
Yeah, and I think that's a wonderful statement.
That was brilliant. Yeah,
really, really sums it up. And I think that's the key. You start a business because you have an idea and because you were different in your idea. And even if it's the same as somebody else had, you might do it in a different way. You might communicate about it in a different way. You might, differentiate yourself in that if you believe in it.
And it does come back to a couple of things that we've talked about today, and that's the self-awareness and the confidence in being yourself, embracing that.
Absolutely. I think the self-awareness is for me a crucial quality of everybody, definitely, but people who want to be leaders, they need to have that quality, I think.
Fabulous. Well, thanks for getting us through the buzz round.
Thank you.
Now, this has been wonderful, Thomas. Where can people find out more about you and maybe even reach out and say thanks for what you've shared today?
I'm happy for every connection, as I said initially. I think that's what I thrive off and live for, to connect with people. So I'm on LinkedIn. Please connect. I'm also, of course, our website, thecrisiscompass.com. And you also find me on Medium and Twitter. I'm not on Facebook. I left 10 years ago and never came back. But yeah, please connect. I'll be happy for every connection.
Great. And we'll post those links on the show notes as well so people can click through. All right. Do you have some parting advice for our listener today?
I think it's just about, crisis is, since I've worked with it, is a word that's heavily loaded, but beyond it, it's all about change. And I think we're all excellent in doing so the past 16 months showed that to everybody, hopefully, even though it was frustrating for many. But we're all reinventors, we're all innovators, and we must not forget that.
Yeah, that's great parting advice. And I always laugh when people say we don't like change, and I kind of respond with, depending on the person, I can be flippant and I'll say, well, you're changing all the time.
Constant change.
Your heartbeat is increasing or decreasing depending on the level of exercise. You're taking deeper breaths this time than a few moments ago because you're speaking. So everything is changing in your body without you even knowing it. And isn't it great that your body is doing that? So embrace change.
It's as you say, and the crisis is an extreme one because we're changing and developing all the time. And if you have this mindset, it becomes maybe less scary. Maybe demystifying it a bit. We'll see.
Okay, and finally, who else should I get on the show and why?
If you could get him, Matthew Walker. That's the guy who wrote the book about the sleep.
Okay.
Definitely.
Right.
He would be a fantastic.
You don't know him personally?
I don't know him personally, but he's very open to these things. But I know one other recommendation, maybe Matt Watkinson. I know him personally. He wrote a fantastic book. It's really about decisions for your businesses. It's a great book, very simple and great advice. So that's also someone I.
Okay. All right. Well, we might get an introduction to Matt from you and invite him onto the show, and I'll get a hold of the book Why We Sleep and maybe reach out to Matthew and give him some feedback on the book and start a conversation, and hopefully we can get him on the show as well.
I think he would be an incredibly added value for the audience, because I think what he has to say is just, it's mind blowing, I think.
All right. Wonderful. Well, thanks so much for sharing your time and your insights so generously with us today, Thomas. I've really enjoyed this. It's been a fascinating conversation. There's been so many valuable tips, I think, that will help our listener to take away some ideas for how they might manage people, manage emotions, deal with people in crises, and even in just building that culture of good decision making. So thanks a lot. All the best for the future, and let's stay in touch.
Thank you, Jürgen. You're an amazing host, and thank you for giving me the space, and I really enjoyed our conversation. So yeah, looking forward to being in touch.
I hope you enjoyed that insightful and informative conversation with Thomas and took something away from his episode. There were so many fascinating and inspiring insights in this conversation with Thomas, from learning multiple ways to communicate to building your culture muscle. I'd love to know what you took away from Thomas's episode. Leave a comment below the blog post, which you can find at innovabiz.co/Thomas Lahnthaler. That is ThomasLahnThaler. All lowercase, all one word, innovabiz.co/Thomas Lahnthaler. You'll also find contact information there for getting in touch with Thomas, as well as links to the Crisis Compass website, his social media pages, his Reinventors podcast, and the other resources we spoke about in today's conversation. If you like this episode, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with at least 2 other people that it might help. You are making a difference in the world. Tag me in when you share that, and I'll reach out to you with a special thank you surprise. Thomas suggested we have a conversation with Matt Wilkinson, author of The Grid, and with Matthew Walker, author of Why We Sleep, on a future InnovaBuzz podcast episode. So Matt and Matthew, keep an eye on your inboxes for an invitation from us to the InnovaBuzz podcast, courtesy of Thomas Lahnthaler. Tune in again to the next episodes of the InnovaBuzz podcast, where we've got yet more fantastic guests lined up, including Arjun Sen of Zen Mango and life coach Diana Gremillion. Thanks for listening to this episode. Make sure you subscribe to the show to be reminded of new episodes. It's free to subscribe. leave a review if you like. Even if you don't like me, I'm okay with that. I'm asking you to leave a review because it helps other people find this show. Go to InnovaBuzz.co to join our marketing transformation community and access a free gift my team and I made for you. It's the Marketing Master Mini Class. We want to give you everything you need to transform your marketing into a human-centered, relationship-focused growth engine. Until next time, I'm Jürgen Strauss from InnovaBuzz. Remember, be awesome and keep innovating.